You know what scares me more than any horror movie possibly can? Being trapped with bad hosts and desperately searching for an excuse to leave, scanning every word from their mouths for even a syllable that I can use to pivot the conversation into my way out the door. That feeling of discomfort is just the absolute worst, but at least we can rest easy knowing that no one would be sick enough to dedicate a whole movie to that. Oh my god, no. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. When Danish actor and filmmaker Christian Taftrup was on vacation with his family, a Dutch family invited them to visit, and being a smart and rational human being, he figured it wasn't a good idea to take his family into the home of strangers. He declined the invitation, but being a storyteller, his mind started firing off with thoughts of what could have happened had they gone, and that was how his 2022 film Speak No Evil came to be. He co-wrote the screenplay with his brother Mads Taftrup, taking the stereotypical friendliness of Danish people and exaggerating it to tell a story about people who just aren't assertive enough in drawing their own boundaries and will allow people to take advantage of them. It's an insanely tense, grounded, and very upsetting movie that captures the feeling of being isolated with people you aren't comfortable around in an uncannily realistic way. I've been recommended this movie many times since I started making videos, and I went into it not really knowing what to expect, and when the credits rolled, I was genuinely shaking. I was completely enthralled by Speak No Evil from the very first shot, and after finally seeing it, I can definitely see why people have been egging me to check it out for so long. A fair word of warning here, this movie is extremely disturbing, and while I wish I could say it was a bad movie so I could disregard it and stop thinking about how unsettled it made me, I can't say that. The movie's incredibly well made for the most part, and I feel like I won't be freed from constantly pondering it until I get through this video, so if you don't mind just moving over in your seat a little bit, let's take a look at Speak No Evil.
I promise you, today, it's gonna be great.
One of the many things that really stands out about this movie is how unrelentingly tense it is, and from the first establishing POV shot of a car driving down a dark dirt road in the middle of the night while a really ominous old school soundtrack kicks in, the butt-cheek clenching commences. Right away, the movie sets up this feeling of being unsafe and isolated. It's really interesting to see just how much tension can be built up with something as simple as this, because there isn't anything actually visibly wrong here. It lingers for so long, and it's so hard to see that you just feel lost and disoriented. And when the music is as foreboding as this, it piles onto that feeling, resulting in an opening shot that's just absolutely gripping. That feeling of nothing directly being wrong, but just having a strong sensation of dread is something that's core to a lot of this movie, and I love how well that feeling is set up from the first scene. I want to touch on that score a bit before I continue. The music was composed by Danish composer Sune Kolster, and the reason that it stood out to me so much is because of how wonderfully old school it is. The score for Speak No Evil feels straight out of a classic Universal monster movie, which I found really neat because it sort of sets up this monster-like evil looming in the movie's story. So while the characters are behaving in a pretty subdued way for the vast majority of the first two acts, you still have this feeling of a grand evil lurking below the surface. I think in order to talk about why this movie works so well, I'm gonna need to touch on certain elements of the movie's ending fairly early on in this video, but before I do that, I want to touch on just how well the movie got under my skin in a wonderfully subdued way. Bjorn and Louise are on vacation in Italy with their daughter Agnes, and during their stay they meet Patrick, Karen, and their son Abel, who was born with a condition that makes his tongue too small to effectively communicate. One of the core elements of this movie is an exaggerated portrayal of the cultural differences between the Dutch and the Danish, and Bjorn and Louise are Danish and Patrick and Karen are Dutch. It's basically riffing on how Dutch culture is seen as more aggressive or pushy, while the Danish are often seen as overly accommodating and friendly, even at their own expense. There's obviously more nuance to the reality of this, but the movie takes those cultural differences and pits them against each other. The roots of the movie's ending are set up very early on when Bjorn Bjorn and Louise are sitting by the pool, and Patrick asks Bjorn to move Agnes's stuff off a chair so he can sit down, which Bjorn obliges. Throughout the movie, Patrick and Karen slowly step further and further across these possessive boundaries, but I love how subtly this is set up at the beginning. There are so many little details during the trip to Italy that are really important, and that's one of the reasons that I found this movie has stayed so present in my mind since I saw it. For now, all that's important to know is that Patrick and Karen are basically feeling out how far they can push things with Bjorn and Louise and how willing they are to submit to what other people want from them. Patrick has a particularly strange reaction when he finds out that Bjorn went wandering the streets to look for Agnes's stuffed bunny when she realizes that she left it behind.
You went to find the rabbit? It's very heroic of you. No, I'm serious. Respect.
Nothing directly off about that, but it's just odd. And that's one of my favorite things about how this movie sets up the dynamic between these two families. A while later, after returning home from their trip, they receive a letter from Patrick and Karen inviting them to come stay at their house, which Louise rationally turns down because they don't know these people and it would be irresponsible to go and stay at their house in another country with their young daughter, which is true and correct and the right way to feel about this.
Det er måske lidt lang tid, der er også nogen, man ikke rigtig kender.
Bjorn, on the other hand, seems more keen on the idea. We learn later on that he feels sort of trapped by the normality of his life, blending into the crowd just as some guy.
It's like I become this person I don't want to be.
But he's itching for more adventure and spontaneity in his routine life, so he's drawn more to the idea of taking this trip and going somewhere new with new people. During dinner with their friends, the invitation is brought up again, and that good old-fashioned Danish friendliness rears its face when one of their friends points out that it would be rude not to accept, and Bjorn latches right on to what they're saying, eventually managing to persuade Louise into agreeing, and they make their way over. I absolutely love how intense the score gets while they're taking a ferry as a part of their journey to Holland. No reason to suspect anything from the characters yet, but the music tells you everything you need to know about how bad of an idea taking this trip was. The first major red flag that stood out to me is something that Karen says not a minute after Bjorn and his family arrive at their house.
Sorry for the mess. Oh, it's nothing. It's gonna get much worse. Come on.
What? I love how this rides the line of something that you'd likely interpret as her referring to how kids are messy, and it's not a huge deal if a mess is made because now that there are two kids in the house, there are going to be messes all the time. But there's something so unsettling about the specific wording of it there that should set off some alarms in their heads, which is a feeling you're only just getting acquainted with because throughout the course of this movie, Bjorn and Louise will concede a lot of things that they really shouldn't in the name of being courteous, which is where that cultural commentary makes itself the most known. There has to be a ton of credit given to the lead actors in this movie, and not just the adults. Often having kids in prominent roles in your movie can be a death sentence for the immersion, and especially when there are such profoundly heavily emotions being asked from the performances, it can be a huge risk. This is even more the case when the movie's performances are very naturalistic, meant to feel like real interactions as opposed to anything theatrical, which is what makes the performances from Leva Forsberg and Marius Damslev all the more impressive. This movie goes to some extremely dark places by the end, but for most of the runtime, the defining feeling is just pure discomfort and tension, knowing that something is clearly wrong and that Bjorn and Louise don't want to stay with these people anymore, but they keep finding reasons to either delay leaving or come back after making the decision to finally go. One of the most difficult scenes of the entire movie is when Abel and Agnes are doing a dance routine for their parents, and Agnes is clearly more into it than Abel is, causing Patrick to become increasingly agitated with Abel's lack of enthusiasm until he's yelling abusively and throwing things. It's a scene that just builds up the intensity, and while that's happening, you can see Agnes as well as her parents become more and more uncomfortable and afraid of what's happening. This sort of performance from a young actor is extremely impressive, since so much of what she's feeling is translated through her body language and not actually anything she's saying. That sort of character awareness is very, very impressive to see in a child actor. Things are really reaching a boiling point by now, as this is a little later on in the story, but this sort of thing can be seen brewing from the beginning. One of the most chilling moments early on is when the two families are out for a walk and they let the kids play at a playground for a while, and Agnes wants to use the slide, but Abel is blocking her way, so she asks her mother to see if she can get him to move. When Louise is unable to, she asks Patrick and Karen if they can maybe get Abel to move off the slide for a moment, and as soon as she does, there's this snap in Patrick's friendly facade as his whole demeanor changes. The anger directed at Abel is instant and extremely unsettling as Patrick storms toward him and aggressively chews into this poor child as Bjorn and Louise watch in complete discomfort. Patrick and Karen both do a great job of playing these people putting on friendly faces, and it's almost easy to believe the facade yourself in the earlier sections of the movie. When Louise convinces Bjorn to leave in the middle of the night, they wind up going back to the house because Agnes's stuffed bunny was left behind, and as was established earlier on, Bjorn is apt to concede to his daughter's wishes with things like this. Patrick and Karen have woken up by this point, and the four of them have a conversation where they lay everything out on the table, with Bjorn trying to smooth off the edges a bit and say he just thought it was time to go home, but Louise really letting loose on the inappropriate behavior from their hosts, like letting Agnes sleep in their room with them the previous night because she was scared and was ignored by her coital parents. Well, I don't think I'd ever reach a point after something like that where I'd be willing to keep my own child in a house with people who are crossing boundaries like that. Patrick and Karen are so convincing in their perspective on the dynamic here that you can almost see where they're coming from. Patrick especially seems very distraught that they've made their guests uncomfortable, and his promises that things will do better kind of tug on the heartstrings because he seems like he really does feel bad and wants to be a good host.
No one's forcing you to stay, but I really hope you do, because today is gonna be a great day.
This is a movie that's best seen knowing as little as possible. I was aware that Patrick and Karen were hiding something when I started the movie, but that's about all I knew going in, and that allowed for this great back and forth pull with whether or not they were being genuine in their kindness towards Bjorn and Louise. I knew that eventually the coin was going to flip, but I didn't know what the nature or circumstances of that were going to be, and this scene in particular really made me question what the motives here were, and that definitely would have been ruined if I'd known the direction things were heading. I was almost convinced at this point that Patrick really did just want to be a good host, but that the couple was hiding some secret that Bjorn would stumble on and that would then put a target on them. In some ways, I was right about that, but there's a lot more going on here that is very intentional on the part of Patrick and Karen that starts to show itself a little more after Bjorn and Louise agree to stay. There are many little moments of Karen in particular trying to tell Agnes what to do, speaking to her in a way that's really only appropriate for the guardian of the child too, and doing this right in front of Louise, setting off more alarms.
Stop telling my daughter what to do.
There's this possessiveness that seems to be developing that becomes extremely uncomfortable, and it's made to be absolutely horrifying once you know where things are going. It's that unease that really defines the vast majority of this movie, and it's handled in such a grounded way that makes it very tangible, injecting every scene with so much tension and uncertainty in a way that very few movies are capable of. There are many uncomfortable moments where the couple overstep boundaries that really should be held firm, but what's not fully clear until the film's conclusion is just how intentional every single one of these things are, going all the way back to that first interaction between Patrick and Bjorn. Other moments take that sort of thing further, like Patrick coming into the bathroom to brush his teeth while Louise is in the shower, or using the bathroom himself while Bjorn is brushing his teeth later on, or when Patrick forgets that Louise is vegetarian and has her try meat and then later challenges her logic behind her dietary choices, making the unnecessary correction that she's pescatarian and not vegetarian since she still eats fish.
But you eat fish, right?
Yes.
Yes, so you're not a vegetarian, you're a pescatarian.
Yes.
It's technically true, but he really should just mind his own business. Essentially, what's happening here is that Patrick and Karen are very intentionally pushing boundaries and asserting dominance, poking and prodding to see just how much Bjorn and Louise will let them get away with and not stand their ground. They're taking advantage of their accommodating culture and seeing how little fight these people have in them, building up to one of the most harrowing final acts I've ever seen. It can be very difficult to successfully transition a thriller from the stage of subdued tension into the reveals in the finale, because if the reveals aren't handled in a believable manner, it can completely dismantle everything that had been built up throughout the film and ruin the whole thing in spite of how good all that buildup may have been. Speak No Evil has a very sudden climax that is a huge smack in the face, and save for a couple little details about how two scenes connect, It's handled incredibly well and feels like the best kind of sudden shift of events that avoids feeling narratively out of nowhere. There's nothing wrong with something coming out of left field if it feels like it could happen within the world of the story, and that's absolutely the case here. In the middle of the night, Bjorn can hear Abel crying out from his room, and Patrick storms down the hall. They have an altercation that ends in sudden silence, setting off every possible red alarm in Bjorn's head as he begins to investigate, making a deeply disturbing discovery. He finds a cabin outside, and after entering finds empty suitcases and other luggage as well as cameras, which are often brought on vacation. He continues on and finds a room full of family photos with Patrick and Karen on vacation meeting different families, but in every one of them they have a different kid with them, and each can be seen with the family from another photo, indicating that Patrick and Karen are essentially working in this loop of luring families in to stay with them, presumably killing the parents and then kidnapping the children and using them for their next ruse. Bjorn's nightmare is confirmed to him when he finds Abel's body face down in a pool, and he quickly rushes to wake Louise and run while he still can, all the while unaware that Patrick knows that he found the cabin. Speak No Evil has an overall very impressive script, filled to the brim with all sorts of little details and setup, leaving very little without narrative purpose. Bjorn and Louise make infuriating decisions the whole way through, but it's not a result of poor writing. It's a part of the cultural commentary at the core of the movie, and in almost every instance, I think it works very well. Christian Taftrup has straight up said that he wanted you to be mad by the time the movie ended, yelling at your screen at the characters not to make the decisions they're making, and he definitely accomplished that. I've been choosing how I word this section very carefully, because there is one sequence where I think that the writing actually does fail at fully holding up the movie's generally believable feel, and that's in how Louise's character behaves after being woken up by Bjorn, and also some of the decisions made following this that just don't feel justified by the movie's core concepts. Earlier on, when they fled in the night, she did the same thing with him in a full panic, wanting to run, and despite agreeing to stay, it's also pretty clear that she wants to leave still. The issue is that when Bjorn comes to her in the middle of the night and wakes her up in the same way that she did, but with even more urgency this time, she doesn't take him seriously, and there's absolutely no reason that she wouldn't.
Agnes, come home.
This doesn't make sense as a part of the cultural commentary because she hasn't exactly been shy about her feelings with Patrick and Karen, so it feels extremely out of character for her to see Bjorn finally take the side she's been on for a while now and not be fully on board with it. There's no urgency in her as they pack up and leave. She doesn't ask what happened, she doesn't seem afraid by how disturbed Bjorn clearly is, and it doesn't end there. While driving through the night, Bjorn is sent into a panic by a car that seems to be sitting in wait for him, and he veers off down a smaller road, which is another decision that I don't really think works here because there's nothing accommodating about thinking you're being followed and then leading the person following you down a more isolated road, but hey. The car winds up getting stuck, but there's a house off in the distance that Bjorn figures may be able to either help or call for help, and he leaves Louise and Agnes in the car while he goes. Here's the thing. The poor decision-making before felt justified by the cultural commentary present in the movie, and actually does feel like people I know who just aren't comfortable calling out others when boundaries are crossed. I can buy almost all of this. But when Bjorn just found irrefutable proof that Patrick killed Abel and that he's planning on killing them and kidnapping their daughter, I would think the last thing he should do after going down into an isolated side road and thinking he may have been followed is to leave his wife and child alone in the car that can't move. It feels like there were a lot of contrivances here in the script to try and force the coming situation, and this brief period of the movie is what I would consider to be the weakest part because it feels so antithetical to the very competent script up to this point. When Bjorn returns from the house after being unable to find help, Louise and Agnes are no longer in the car, and this is where, in spite of the really messy writing in the last few minutes, that uneasy feeling that's been present throughout the movie begins to shift to queasiness, and things are only getting started. A car rolls down the road towards Bjorn, and he sees that it's Patrick and Karen, Agnes and Louise as passengers. Although Louise and Agnes seem to be unaware of the danger they're in at this point, which is another issue I have here. Louise does not trust these two, and especially after Bjorn woke her up in complete panic and then rushed them out of the house, she should not be this at ease with being in a car with them in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night, or being around them at all for that sake. She would see Bjorn's expression here as Patrick commands that he get in the car, the friendly mask now dropped and revealing the dark nature that's been lurking just below the surface the whole movie. I just find it incredibly difficult to buy that after everything that's happened, Louise would show no sign of being afraid of Patrick and Karen in this moment. All of that being said, The troubles with the script are about to be left behind and replaced by one of the most disturbing, haunting, and difficult to watch scenes I've watched in a movie in a long time. And if I hadn't watched The Coffee Table earlier this year, this would easily be the most disturbing thing I've sat through in years. Bjorn and Louise's entire world is about to collapse in front of them in a matter of minutes. Starting off with the reveal that there's another car here when Patrick flashes his headlights to indicate something to them. With the nature of my videos focusing heavily on horror, I've had a few instances where things have been flagged for certain subject matter, and to err on the side of caution, I'm gonna sort of dance around the actual details of what goes down here, but I think I can still get the point across. Remember how Abel was unable to speak because of a condition he was born with? That was a complete lie. The actual reason that Abel couldn't communicate properly is because of a mutilation at the hands of Patrick and Karen. Abel tried to show this to Bjorn earlier on in the movie, but it was brushed off as just a strange behavior from a troubled kid. The same thing that happened to Abel happens to Agnes during this scene in the car, and there's absolutely no way I can show it on YouTube, but the whole thing plays out on screen in close-ups that made my head spin and my chest tighten up, but it's not like this is a moment reliant solely on the graphic violence to leave the impact that it does, although that doubtlessly is a big part of it. The thing that makes this sequence so unbelievably haunting is how real it feels. The whole time I felt like I was trapped in this car while Karen callously tells Louise to let go of Agnes in the most evil, cold voice she can.
More. You will let go. Yes. No. You will.
I was hearing her say this in my head for days after watching the movie, feeling my chest tighten up every time it would pop into my mind. The sense of panic in this scene is so well realized as Louise starts to notice how bad this all is before the whole thing crescendos in that horrible event. So many things serve to give this scene the intense dread that defines it, from the absolutely stellar performances from everyone, how sudden the shift in tone is, and how unforgiving the movie is in not letting the moment end. Another detail I didn't even mention before is that Patrick and Karen hired a babysitter to watch Abel and Agnes while they went out for dinner, which Bjorn and Louise were under the impression would be an outing that the kids would be coming on, and the babysitter is assisting in the thing that's getting harder to talk about because I can't actually describe it. The effect is very good, but far and above the practical work here is the psychological impact that this sequence has. It's so horrible that I was literally shaking by the end of it, and I felt like I was on the verge of a panic attack, but there's also something messed up in me that respects when a filmmaker is capable of evoking such a strong reaction out of me, and I just can't look away. Once the deed is done, the babysitter takes off with Agnes, who is no longer able to speak, and Patrick and Karen take these traumatized parents on a walk to a spot where Patrick had brought Bjorn a while prior to this on a little day trip they were taking, where Bjorn revealed a lot of his feelings about being trapped in his life, and Patrick showed him this spot so they could let loose these primal cathartic screams to release some sort of pent-up tension. In reality, he was doing this because he had this whole thing planned out and wanted to let Bjorn know that no one would hear them scream out here. Bjorn and Louise are absolutely broken, simply husks of who they were before the world-shattering nightmare they just bore witness to, and they're forced to strip down before Patrick and Karen stone them to death in a sequence that's portrayed yet again in a fashion that is way too realistic for me to be anything but on the brink of complete panic while watching. Now you might be wondering why they didn't fight back here, considering Patrick and Karen are unarmed. Well, it loops back to the whole point of this movie, and it really gets cleared up when Bjorn asks why they're doing this to them.
Because you let me.
And Patrick's completely right about this. For the entirety of this movie, he and Karen have been pushing boundaries that most people would logically deem completely unacceptable and either demand they stop or simply leave. But Bjorn and Louise continuously allowed them and their daughter to remain in this situation that was so clearly unsafe for them. All the major red flags were laid out before them, like Patrick tricking Bjorn into paying for the dinner bill that was clearly presented as a treat from the hosts, and then driving home drunk while completely disregarding how upset the volume of the music was making Louise.
Turn down the fucking music!
Them bringing in Agnes to sleep with them, Patrick watching Bjorn and Louise have sex, or the clear signs of abuse towards Abel that should have caused them to flee and alert child services. Hell, it's even revealed that Patrick lied about what he does for work. At the start of the movie, he tells them that he's a doctor, and they later learn that not only is he not in the medical field, but he doesn't even have a job and doesn't believe in working.
I've never worked. I don't believe in working.
They had every chance in the world to put a stop to these things or distance themselves from what was clearly a hostile and manipulative couple, but They didn't. Because of their overly accommodating nature and unwillingness to say no to things that they should, Patrick and Karen were able to walk all over them the entire time and become more and more possessive until they take this final horrifying step. It can be absolutely infuriating to watch how much Bjorn and Louise let slide during their time with these people, and it's all been building up to this moment where they don't even try and fight back. These are submissive characters who are far too willing to give in and accept defeat, and you're meant to be angry with them by the end. That doesn't make it any less tragic, but on top of the horrible sadness here is absolute rage at the fact that Bjorn and Louise let it get to this point, and I think overall the movie's actually got a pretty solid lesson in hammering home that you do need to be able to not only draw your boundaries, but strongly reinforce them. The movie is of course an exaggeration of this, but I think it does a genuinely good job at touching on that kind of thing through this ending that's like getting woken up by someone dumping an ice bucket on your head. The sequence of them being stoned to death is played out in slow motion with the sound being completely muted while a deeply tragic score plays, and it was at this moment where I almost felt like I was going to tap out of the movie because of how uncomfortably real it felt. This is just the utter desolation of a family unit, and I found it incredibly difficult to sit through. The ending of the movie is very much a bad guys win kind of situation, as Agnes is now in Abel's place as playing the part of Patrick and Karen's mute child as they begin searching for their next victim to start the whole thing over again. And that's how it ends. It's a challenging movie, and I think aside from some of the contrivances in the minutes between Bjorn discovering the shed and them all being in the car, the script is absolutely incredible. It's a really well-written movie with so many little details and breadcrumbs laid out that you may not even notice until you're looking back on them afterwards. And if you're anything like me, this thing is going to be spinning around in your head for many days following your viewing as you try and piece it together and make sense of all of it. Some movies are frustrating because it feels like the entire point was shock value, and while shock absolutely plays into the conclusion of this story, there's so much more of a point to the things that go down here than a lot of other movies I've seen where things like this happen. It's cultural parody without a doubt, but it's also just a reminder that you need to be able to draw boundaries and stand by them. Lead your life as your own, don't be subservient, and trust your instincts. The title Speak No Evil is such a good reflection of the movie's themes, as Bjorn and Louise often refuse to speak up or push back out of fear that they'll upset others or make things awkward, and that's what ultimately leads to the destruction of their family. They don't want to rock the boat. Don't disturb the calm water and all will be well, until the creature beneath the surface sneaks up on you. I didn't even really get around to talking about just how good the performances from the non-child actors are. There's a hell of a lot asked in the actors in this script with how naturalistic and grounded so much of it is, and it's very engaging to watch these characters interact because of how detailed and nuanced the performances are. Fata Van Hewitt as Patrick was the standout to me because of how his friendliness seems so genuine, making it more believable that Bjorn is willing to forgive some of the uncomfortable pushes he makes because he seems like a nice dude who just doesn't pick up on boundaries well, but he can so quickly pull back that mask and become an intimidating and frightening villain. Karina Smulders as Karen is far more subtle through the movie, but her understated performance makes it really hard to tell what's going on beneath the surface, and she feels so eerie, cold, and distant during that scene in the car. Morten Burian as Bjorn is extremely believable as this man who feels like he's being forced to shove down the way he wants to live his life and is trying so hard to ignore all of these red flags because of how badly he wants to hold on to this sense of adventure and be liked by Patrick, who presents a more free-living lifestyle. Sidel CM Ko as Louise is probably my second favorite performance after Fata Van Hewitt, playing this constantly on-edge mother who really should have been listened to with no hesitation because she picked up on the odd vibe right away. I'm doing my best with these pronunciations, by the way, I'm so sorry. Especially during the final scene where she's physically shaken like she just climbed out of an ice bath after what happened to Agnes. Her physicality in the role is so damn good. Speak No Evil is an incredibly well-written, acted, and paced movie that has left an impact on me that few have. I just can't stop thinking about it, and I always respect when a filmmaker is able to leave me with an impression that potent, and I think it's especially impressive that a movie that made me as uncomfortable and angry as this one did has managed to keep me fascinated long after I finished it. It's definitely not a movie for everyone, and I'd imagine especially not those with families of their own, but the core themes and messages in the movie are so well conveyed and expressed that I can't help but kind of love it. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.